Marcus Johnson couldn't stop his hands from shaking as he sat in the large courtroom. The 16-year-old boy kept pulling at the collar of his borrowed suit, which felt too tight around his neck. His mother had gotten it from their church's donation center just yesterday. It was a little too big in the shoulders and slightly too short in the arms, but it was the best they could do on such short notice. The courtroom was bigger than Marcus had imagined. He had only seen courtrooms on TV shows before. This felt different. The ceiling was high, with bright fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh and cold. The wooden benches behind him were filled with people he didn't know, their whispers creating a soft but constant noise that made him even more nervous. In the front row sat his mother, Sarah Johnson. She looked tired and worried, with dark circles under her eyes from working double shifts at the hospital as a nurse's aide. She hadn't missed a single day of the trial, even though it meant taking unpaid leave from one of her jobs. Every time Marcus looked at her, she tried to give him a brave smile, but he could see the fear in her eyes. Judge Sarah Martinez sat high above everyone else, looking down from her bench with a stern expression. She was known as a tough but fair judge, with 20 years of experience in the juvenile court system. Her black robe seemed to make her even more intimidating as she shuffled through the papers in front of her. Marcus watched as his public defender, Lisa Chen, organized her papers at the defense table. She seemed nice but overwhelmed. He had only met with her 3 times before the trial, and each meeting had been rushed. She had so many other cases to handle, and Marcus knew he was just one of many clients she had to defend that week. On the other side of the courtroom, Assistant District Attorney Thomas Bradford sat confidently at his table. His suit was perfectly pressed, and his leather briefcase probably cost more than everything Marcus was wearing combined. Bradford had a reputation for being tough on crime, and he had made it clear from the beginning that he wanted to make an example of this case. The jury box held 12 people who would decide Marcus's fate. He had watched them carefully during jury selection, trying to guess what they were thinking. Some looked at him with sympathy, others with suspicion, and a few seemed to avoid looking at him altogether. They were a mix of different ages and backgrounds, but Marcus couldn't help noticing that none of them looked like him or came from his neighborhood. Officer James Wilson, the arresting officer, stood by the courtroom door in his crisp blue uniform. He kept his hand resting near his belt, as if Marcus might try to run at any moment. The officer had been polite but firm during the arrest, treating Marcus like he was already guilty. The court clerk, an older woman with glasses hanging from a chain around her neck, called the court to order. "All rise." Her voice rang out through the courtroom. Everyone stood as Judge Martinez prepared to begin the proceedings. Marcus's legs felt weak as he got to his feet. The weight of what was about to happen pressed down on Marcus's shoulders. He knew that everything would change after today. If things went wrong, he could lose his freedom, his future, and everything he had worked so hard for. His dreams of going to college, of becoming a lawyer himself one day, all hung in the balance. He thought about the library where he volunteered, helping younger kids with their homework. He thought about his spot on the debate team, which he had to give up after his arrest. He thought about his mother's face when the police had come to their apartment, and how she had never once doubted him when he said he was innocent. As Judge Martinez began her opening statements, Marcus tried to sit up straight and look confident, just as Ms. Chen had advised him. But inside, his heart was racing. The clock on the wall seemed to tick louder with each passing second, marking time in a way that made every moment feel important and final. This was it. The trial was about to begin, and Marcus Johnson, 16 years old, honor student, and volunteer tutor, was about to face the biggest challenge of his young life. What happened next would either prove his innocence or destroy everything he had ever hoped for. 2 months before the trial, Marcus Johnson's life had been completely different. That Wednesday afternoon had started like any other day, with nothing to suggest it would change everything. The autumn air was cool, and fallen leaves crunched under his feet as he walked his usual route from the library to his home in the Pine Grove apartment complex. Marcus had just finished his regular tutoring session with 3 middle school students. He specialized in helping them with math and science, subjects where he excelled. The library's old wall clock had shown 5:45 p.m. when he packed up his textbooks and said goodbye to Mrs. Thompson, the kind elderly librarian who always saved him a quiet study room for his tutoring sessions. At home, his mother's note waited on their small kitchen table, held down by a salt shaker. Dinner in the fridge. Heated up. Working late shift. Love you. Marcus smiled at her neat handwriting. She always left him notes, even though they both knew her schedule by heart. Night shifts at the hospital paid better, and they needed every extra dollar they could get. 6 blocks away from the library, while Marcus was walking home, the Red Star convenience store was being robbed. The suspect, captured on grainy security footage, wore a dark hoodie similar to the one Marcus had on that day. The footage showed someone roughly his height and build, though the face was never clearly visible. The robber had taken $246 from the register and knocked over a display of chips before running away. Mr. Patel, the store owner, had called the police immediately. Officer Wilson arrived at the scene within minutes. A witness, Mrs. Garcia, who had been buying milk when it happened, gave a description that made Officer Wilson think of Marcus. He had seen the teenager around the neighborhood before and had once warned him about jaywalking across Mason Street. The next morning, while Marcus was getting ready for school, 2 police cars pulled up outside their apartment. His mother had just returned from her night shift and was still in her nurse's aide uniform when they knocked. The officers were polite but firm as they asked Marcus to come with them for questioning. At the police station, Marcus sat in a small room with metal chairs and blank walls. He kept telling them about the library, about Tommy, Sarah, and Miguel, the kids he was tutoring. He mentioned Mrs. Thompson and the sign-in sheet at the front desk. But something in the officers' faces told him they weren't really listening. The evidence seemed to pile up against him. The partial fingerprint found on the knocked-over chip display was similar to his. The security camera footage, though blurry, showed someone wearing night shoes like his. Mrs. Garcia, though not completely sure, said he looked like the person she saw. His mother scraped together enough money to pay for a consultation with a private lawyer, but the fees for full representation were far beyond their means. The lawyer had looked through the case files and sighed, suggesting they work with the public defender's office instead. That's how they met Ms. Chen, who was already handling 30 other cases that month. Marcus's teachers tried to help. His debate team coach, Mr. Reynolds, wrote a letter vouching for his character. His chemistry teacher, Ms. Martinez, no relation to the judge, offered to testify about his perfect attendance and high grades. But as the case moved forward, it seemed like nobody was interested in who Marcus really was. The local newspaper ran a small story about the robbery on page 6. They didn't name Marcus because he was a minor, but in his neighborhood, everyone knew. Some of his classmates stopped talking to him. Parents told their kids to find another tutor. Only the 3 students he had been helping that day, Tommy, Sarah, and Miguel, stuck by him, though their parents wouldn't let them visit anymore. In the 2 months between his arrest and the trial, Marcus watched his normal life disappear. He was suspended from school pending the trial's outcome. The library had to find another student tutor. His mother's proud smiles turned into worried glances. Their apartment felt smaller, the walls closer, as they waited for their court date. And now, sitting in the courtroom, Marcus realized how much had changed because of one afternoon, one robbery he hadn't committed, and one case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, or rather, being the wrong person who looked right for the blame. Assistant District Attorney Thomas Bradford stood up slowly from his chair, straightening his expensive red tie. The fluorescent lights reflected off his gold cufflinks as he walked toward the jury box. His shoes made soft clicking sounds on the courtroom floor, and Marcus noticed they were so shiny he could almost see his reflection in them. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Bradford began, his voice confident and clear. "What we have here is a simple case." He paused, making eye contact with each juror. A young man made a bad choice. That choice was to rob the Red Star convenience store on October 15th, threatening the safety of honest, hard-working citizens. Marcus felt his stomach tighten as Bradford walked over to a large screen set up in the courtroom. The prosecutor clicked a remote, and the grainy security camera footage began to play. The black and white video showed someone in a dark hoodie entering the store. Marcus could feel 12 pairs of eyes moving back and forth between him and the figure on the screen. "Notice, members of the jury, the height of the suspect," Bradford said, using a laser pointer to highlight the door frame. 5 feet, 9 inches, exactly matching the defendant's height. He clicked to another frame. "Notice the distinctive Nike shoes, the same brand and model found in the defendant's apartment." Marcus looked down at his feet. He wasn't wearing those shoes today. His mother had returned them to the store after the arrest. They had been a birthday present, bought on sale after 3 months of saving. Now he wore plain black dress shoes borrowed from his cousin. Bradford moved on to his next piece of evidence. The partial fingerprint found on the fallen chip display. He showed enlarged photos of the fingerprint analysis. Our experts will testify that this print shares 11 distinct characteristics with the defendant's fingerprints. The probability of this being a coincidence is extremely low. Mrs. Garcia, the witness from the store, sat in the back of the courtroom. She would testify later, but Bradford was already pointing her out to the jury. A respected member of our community, who has lived in the neighborhood for 20 years, will tell you what she saw that day. She will testify that the person she saw matches the defendant's description. Marcus watched his public defender, Ms. Chen, taking notes. Her pen moved quickly across her yellow legal pad, but her shoulders looked tense. You could see worry lines forming on her forehead as Bradford continued presenting evidence. Furthermore, Bradford said, walking back to his table and picking up a manila folder, the defendant's story about being at the library doesn't hold up. Yes, there's a sign-in sheet. Yes, there are students who say he was there. But there's a 20-minute gap in his timeline, more than enough time to commit this crime. He pulled out a map of the neighborhood and displayed it on the screen. Red lines showed the distance between the library and the convenience store. 6 blocks, Bradford said firmly. That's all it is. A 6-block run that would take less than 10 minutes. Plenty of time to commit the robbery and return to the library before anyone noticed. Marcus felt his heart beating faster. He wanted to stand up and shout about how wrong this all was, but Miss Chen had warned him to stay quiet and trust the system. He looked at his mother in the front row. She was clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Bradford saved his strongest argument for last. He clicked to a new image. A side-by-side comparison of Marcus's school ID photo and a blurry still from the security footage. Look at these images, ladies and gentlemen. Same height, same build, same general features. The defendant had the means, the opportunity, and as we'll show through evidence of his family's financial struggles, the motive. Marcus felt angry tears forming in his eyes, but he blinked them back. He couldn't let the jury see him cry. His mother had always taught him that people sometimes judge unfairly based on emotions, and he didn't want to give them any reason to think he was guilty. As Bradford finished his opening statement, he turned to face the jury one last time. By the end of this trial, you will have no reasonable doubt that Marcus Johnson committed this robbery. The evidence speaks for itself, and that evidence points to only one conclusion: guilty. He returned to his seat, straightening his papers with a satisfied look on his face. The courtroom fell silent. Judge Martinez looked at Ms. Chen, indicating it was time for the defense's opening statement. Marcus watched his lawyer stand up slowly, knowing she would try her best, but wondering if anyone would believe the truth when the lies seemed so convincing. Lisa Chen stood up from the defense table, smoothing her wrinkled navy blazer. Unlike Bradford's expensive suit, her outfit came from a department store sale rack. She had been up until 3 a.m. preparing for today, and it showed in the dark circles under her eyes. But she stood tall, determined to fight for her young client. "Your Honor, members of the jury," she began, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "The prosecution has shown you a collection of coincidences. That's all they have. Coincidences. What they haven't shown you is who Marcus Johnson really is." She walked over to Marcus and placed a gentle hand on the back of his chair. "This young man sits before you today, accused of a crime he didn't commit. The prosecution wants you to see a suspect who matches a description. I want you to see the real Marcus Johnson." Ms. Chen turned to her first exhibit, Marcus's report card. "Honor roll student," she said, holding it up. Straight as in advanced placement classes. But Bradford jumped to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor," he called out. "The defendant's academic performance is not relevant to the charges." Judge Martinez nodded, sustained. "Please stick to evidence related to the crime, Ms. Chen." Marcus watched as his lawyer's shoulders dropped slightly. She had warned him this might happen, but it still hurt to see his achievements dismissed so quickly. She moved on to her next point. "We have 3 students who were with Marcus at the library," Ms. Chen continued. She held up the library's sign-in sheet. Tommy Rodriguez, Sarah Kim, and Miguel Torres, all ready to testify that Marcus was tutoring them in math and science that afternoon. Bradford stood again. Objection, Your Honor. As I demonstrated, the defendant had sufficient time to commit the robbery between tutoring sessions. Overruled. Judge Martinez said. But keep it brief, Ms. Chen. Mrs. Thompson, the librarian, sat in the courtroom waiting to testify. She had brought additional sign-in sheets and her personal notes about Marcus's tutoring schedule. But as she watched Bradford prepare his cross-examination questions, she worried her testimony might not be enough. Ms. Chen tried a different approach. The prosecution's fingerprint evidence is incomplete, she argued. A partial print with 11 matching points is not conclusive proof. Many experts require 14 to 16 matching points for a positive identification. She displayed her own enlarged fingerprint analysis, but it wasn't as clear or professional-looking as Bradford's. The public defender's office couldn't afford the same high-tech presentation equipment as the district attorney. Marcus's mother watched anxiously from her seat. She had used all her savings and even borrowed money from her sister to hire an independent fingerprint expert. But he had backed out at the last minute, leaving Ms. Chen scrambling to find a replacement she could afford. Furthermore, Ms. Chen continued, the witness, Mrs. Garcia, isn't completely certain about her identification. She walked toward the jury. She said the suspect looked like Marcus. In a city of millions, how many young men of similar height and build could look like the person she saw? Bradford's objection came quickly. Speculation, Your Honor. Sustained. Judge Martinez ruled. The jury will disregard that last statement. Ms. Chen pressed on, though each sustained objection seemed to drain more energy from her voice. She talked about Marcus's volunteer work, his dreams of becoming a lawyer, his role helping raise his younger cousins. But with each attempt to show his character, Bradford's objections cut her off. The morning wore on, and Marcus could see some jurors starting to lose interest. One older man in the back row had closed his eyes. A young woman in the front was checking her watch. Even Judge Martinez seemed to be growing impatient with the defense's struggling presentation. Finally, Ms. Chen returned to her key point, reasonable doubt. The prosecution's case is built on maids and might-have-beens, she said. Maybe the fingerprint is similar. Maybe the person in the video looks like Marcus. Maybe he could have run 6 blocks in 10 minutes. But maybe is not enough to convict. Maybe is the very definition of reasonable doubt. As she returned to her seat, Marcus could read the frustration on her face. She had fought hard, but against the prosecution's polished presentation and seemingly endless resources, her best efforts felt inadequate. The truth was there, but without the tools to present it effectively, she worried it might stay hidden behind Bradford's wall of circumstantial evidence. The afternoon session was about to begin. Judge Martinez adjusted her reading glasses as she prepared to address a technical point about evidence admission. The courtroom had grown stuffy, and the old air conditioning system hummed loudly in the background. Marcus could feel sweat forming under his borrowed suit jacket. Mrs. Garcia had just finished her testimony. She hadn't been as certain in person as the prosecution had promised. I think it was him, she had said, her voice wavering. The build looked similar, but it happened so fast. Bradford had tried to strengthen her testimony on redirect, but doubt had crept into some jurors' faces. Marcus sat at the defense table, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The morning's proceedings kept replaying in his mind. He thought about the security footage, the fingerprint analysis, and most importantly, about something nobody had mentioned yet. Something that had been bothering him since the trial began. Ms. Chen was shuffling through her papers, preparing to cross-examine the next witness, the fingerprint expert. She looked tired. Marcus had seen her yawning during the lunch break, trying to hide it behind a cup of coffee from the courthouse vending machine. She was doing her best, but she had been given so little time to prepare. Judge Martinez cleared her throat. Before we continue with the next witness, there's a matter of admissibility we need to discuss. She began reading from a document in front of her, her voice carrying the formal tone of legal procedure. That's when Marcus felt something change inside him. It wasn't anger or fear. It was clarity. In his advanced placement civics class, they had studied about justice and truth. His teacher, Mr. Peterson, had always said that the truth had power if you were brave enough to speak it. Marcus looked at his mother in the front row. She had taught him to always be honest, no matter what. Even when he was little and had broken her favorite coffee mug, she had been prouder of him for telling the truth than angry about the mug. The judge's voice seemed to fade into the background as Marcus felt his heart pounding in his chest. He knew what he had to do, even though he knew it wasn't allowed. Even though Ms. Chen had specifically told him not to speak unless asked to testify. Slowly, Marcus pushed his chair back. The legs made a soft scraping sound against the courtroom floor. Ms. Chen was too focused on her papers to notice at first, but others did. A murmur started in the gallery behind him. Marcus stood up straight, his legs shaking slightly but his resolve firm. Now Ms. Chen noticed. She reached for his arm, whispering urgently, "Marcus, sit down." "You can't." "Your Honor," Marcus said, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat and tried again, louder this time. "Your Honor, please." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Martinez looked up from her papers, her expression shifting from surprise to stern disapproval. "Young man, you need to sit down immediately. Your attorney speaks for you in this court." Bradford stood up, straightening his tie with a satisfied smile. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular." The defendant. But Marcus didn't sit down. He couldn't. Not now. "Your Honor, there's something important that nobody knows. Something about the back entrance of the library." Judge Martinez's gavel came down hard. "Order. Mr. Johnson, I must insist." "Please," Marcus said, his voice stronger now, fueled by desperation and truth. "Just 2 minutes. That's all I'm asking for. 2 minutes to show you something nobody has looked at." The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Officer Wilson took a step forward from his position by the door. Marcus's mother had her hands pressed against her mouth, her eyes wide with worry. Miss Chen looked like she might faint. Judge Martinez studied Marcus's face for a long moment. In her 20 years on the bench, she had seen many defendants act out, but something about this young man's demeanor was different. There was no anger, no defiance, just a quiet determination. The next few seconds would change everything. As Marcus stood there, straight-backed and trembling but determined, the entire courtroom held its breath, waiting to see what Judge Martinez would do, and what Marcus Johnson, the 16-year-old defendant who dared to break courtroom protocol, was so desperate to say. Judge Martinez tapped her fingers on the bench, studying Marcus's face. The courtroom remained silent, waiting for her decision. After what felt like forever, she spoke. "Mr. Johnson, you understand you're breaking court procedure." "Yes, Your Honor," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "But there's evidence that could prove I'm innocent, evidence my lawyer doesn't know about because I just remembered it last night." The judge leaned forward. "You have exactly 2 minutes. Choose your words carefully." Bradford jumped up again. "Your Honor, this is completely." "Sit down, Mr. Bradford," Judge Martinez said firmly. 2 minutes won't hurt your case if it's as strong as you claim." Marcus took a deep breath. The library has 2 entrances, the main one in front and a back door near the study rooms. The security camera that shows the front entrance was checked, but nobody looked at the back entrance camera. Ms. Chen's eyes widened. She hadn't known about a second camera. "The back door is where I always enter because it's closer to the study rooms," Marcus continued. "Mrs. Thompson, the librarian, she keeps the footage for a month. She's here today. She can confirm it. The camera would show me entering at 3:30 p.m. and staying until 5:45 p.m. Mrs. Thompson stood up in the gallery. "Your Honor, he's right about the camera. I tried to tell the police, but they'd only asked about the front entrance." Judge Martinez raised her eyebrow. "Continue, Mr. Johnson." "There's more," Marcus said, gaining confidence. "The study room has its own sign-in sheet, separate from the main desk. It shows exactly when we start and finish each session. Tommy, Sarah, and Miguel, we were working on their science project about water pollution. We even took pictures of their experiment." He turned to look at Bradford. "You said there was a 20-minute gap in my timeline, but there wasn't. The sign-in sheet for study room B would show I never left. Tommy's mom even brought him a snack at 4:30, right when the robbery was happening." The young boy's mother stood up in the back of the courtroom. "That's true, Your Honor. I brought cookies for all the kids." Marcus was helping them understand the P of scale. Bradford's face had turned red. "This is all very convenient, Your Honor, but—" "The cookies were chocolate chip," Marcus interrupted, his voice growing stronger. "Tommy shared them with Sarah, but Miguel couldn't have any because he's allergic to nuts. It's all there. The back entrance footage would show Mrs. Rodriguez bringing the cookies. The study room sheet would show we never left. The pictures of the science project would show the timestamps. Judge Martinez held up her hand. Mr. Johnson, are you saying this evidence exists but was never collected? Yes, Your Honor. And there's one more thing. Marcus paused, gathering his courage. The hoodie in the security video, the prosecution says it matches mine. But mine has a small tear on the right sleeve. I caught it on a nail while helping my mom fix our kitchen cabinet. The person in the robbery video, their hoodie doesn't have that tear. You can see it clearly when they reach for the cash register. The courtroom erupted in whispers. Ms. Chen was frantically writing notes. Bradford's confident smile had disappeared completely. If someone just checks the back entrance footage, the study room sign-in sheet, and looks at the hoodie closer, Marcus's voice cracked slightly. The truth is there. It's been there all along. I didn't do this, Your Honor. I couldn't have. I was helping those kids learn about science, eating cookies, and trying to make their project better. That's all. His 2 minutes were up. Marcus's legs felt weak, but he remained standing. Judge Martinez studied him for a long moment, then turned to Mrs. Thompson. Ma'am, do you still have access to this security footage? Yes, Your Honor. All footage is kept for 30 days. We still have 2 days before it's erased. The judge nodded slowly. Mr. Bradford, Ms. Chen approached the bench. As the attorneys walked forward, Marcus finally sat down. His mother was crying silently in the gallery, but now they were tears of hope. For the first time since his arrest, someone was going to look at all the evidence, not just the pieces that made him look guilty, but the parts that proved he was innocent. The truth was finally going to come out, all because he found the courage to stand up and speak. The next morning, the courtroom had a different feeling. Judge Martinez had ordered an immediate investigation of the new evidence, and now everyone waited to hear the results. The wooden benches were packed with spectators, including several local reporters who had heard about Marcus's unusual courtroom speech. Officer Wilson stood near the evidence table, looking uncomfortable. He had been the one sent to check the library's back entrance footage the night before. Next to him sat Mrs. Thompson, the librarian, holding a thick folder of sign-in sheets and a USB drive containing the security videos. Marcus sat at the defense table, wearing the same borrowed suit but somehow looking different. The fear in his eyes had been replaced by something else, hope. His mother sat in her usual spot in the front row, clutching a small photo of Marcus at his middle school graduation. At exactly 9:00 a.m., Judge Martinez entered the courtroom. Everyone stood, and the room fell silent. She adjusted her glasses and looked directly at the prosecution table. Mr. Bradford, she said, her voice stern, would you care to explain why your office failed to collect such crucial evidence? Bradford stood slowly, his usual confidence missing. Your Honor, we followed standard procedure. The front entrance footage clearly showed. Standard procedure, Judge Martinez interrupted, includes checking all possible security cameras, does it not? Yes, Your Honor, Bradford admitted. We should have been more thorough. The judge turned to Officer Wilson. Please share what you found in the back entrance footage. Officer Wilson stepped forward, clearing his throat. Your Honor, the footage clearly shows Marcus Johnson entering the library at 3:27 p.m. through the back door. He doesn't leave until 5:45 p.m. During that time, at approximately 4:30 p.m., Mrs. Rodriguez is seen entering with what appears to be a cookie container. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Marcus felt Ms. Chen's hand squeeze his shoulder gently. Furthermore, Officer Wilson continued, we recovered the study room sign-in sheet. It shows continuous occupation of Room B by Marcus and his 3 students from 3:30 p.m. to 5:45 p.m. The times match perfectly with the security footage. Mrs. Thompson stood up next, holding up her folder. I also have the students' science project photos, Your Honor. They're time-stamped and show all 4 of them working on the pH testing experiment. You can see the cookies in some of the pictures. Judge Martinez nodded. And what about the hoodie, Officer Wilson? We reviewed the robbery footage in high definition, Wilson replied. Marcus is right. The suspect's hoodie shows no tear on the right sleeve. We compared it to Marcus's hoodie, which has a clear tear exactly where he described it. Bradford sank lower in his chair as Officer Wilson continued. There's more, Your Honor. When we looked closer at the convenience store footage, we noticed something we missed before. The suspect appears to be left-handed. All security footage from the library shows Marcus writing and working with his right hand. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Judge Martinez banged her gavel once for silence. In light of this new evidence, she began, I ordered the police to review other recent robberies in the area. Officer Wilson, please share what you found. Wilson nodded. Yes, Your Honor. We discovered 3 similar robberies in neighboring districts, all committed by what appears to be the same person. Last night, based on this pattern, officers arrested James Murphy, age 19, attempting to rob a convenience store in the same manner. Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. The name sounded familiar. Mr. Murphy, Wilson continued, has confessed to all 4 robberies, including the one at Red Star. He was identified by Mrs. Garcia in a new lineup, and his fingerprints matched the partial print from the chip display. He's also left-handed and was wearing an identical hoodie when arrested. Tears started flowing down Marcus's mother's face. Several jurors were shaking their heads, looking at Marcus with new eyes. Even Mrs. Garcia, sitting in the back, had her head bowed in shame. Judge Martinez took off her glasses and looked around the courtroom. The morning sun streaming through the high windows seemed brighter somehow, as if justice itself was shining a light on the truth. In light of this evidence, she said, her voice clear and firm, we will reconvene after a brief recess. Mr. Bradford, I expect you'll have something to say about the charges against Mr. Johnson when we return. As the judge stood to leave, Marcus felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The truth hadn't just come out. It had been proven, documented, and verified. His courage to speak up had set everything in motion, and now, finally, everyone could see what he had known all along. He was innocent. After the recess, the courtroom had a completely different atmosphere. The tension that had filled the air for days was gone, replaced by a sense of anticipation. Marcus sat straighter in his chair, his borrowed suit no longer feeling too tight around his neck. Assistant District Attorney Bradford stood before the court, his earlier confidence replaced by humility. Your Honor, in light of the new evidence and Mr. Murphy's confession, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Marcus Johnson. He paused, adjusting his tie. We offer our sincere apologies for this miscarriage of justice. Judge Martinez nodded, then did something unusual. She stepped down from her bench and walked to stand in front of Marcus. The entire courtroom watched in surprise. Mr. Johnson, she said, her voice gentler than it had been all week, I've been a judge for 20 years. In that time, I've learned that justice sometimes requires courage from unexpected sources. She looked directly at him. Your bravery in speaking up, even when court procedures said you shouldn't, helped uncover the truth. I want to personally apologize for what you've been through. Marcus felt tears forming in his eyes, but this time he didn't try to hold them back. His mother was already crying openly in the gallery, and Mrs. Thompson, the librarian, was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. All charges against Marcus Johnson are hereby dismissed, Judge Martinez declared, returning to her bench. The sound of her gavel echoed through the courtroom. Mr. Johnson, you are free to go. Ms. Chen hugged Marcus, whispering, You did it. You really did it. Even Officer Wilson came forward to shake his hand, apologizing for not checking all the evidence more carefully at the beginning. But Judge Martinez wasn't finished. Furthermore, she continued, I am ordering a complete review of all juvenile cases handled by this court in the past year. We need to ensure that no other evidence has been overlooked, no other stones left unturned. The 3 students Marcus had been tutoring, Tommy, Sarah, and Miguel, were jumping up and down in the back of the courtroom. Their parents, who had once been afraid to let them near Marcus, were now smiling and clapping. Mrs. Garcia approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. I'm so sorry, she said softly. I should have been more careful with my identification. I was just so scared after the robbery. Marcus surprised everyone by giving her a gentle hug. It's okay, he said. You were trying to help catch the real robber. Now he's been caught, and he can't hurt anyone else. Bradford packed up his expensive briefcase, looking humbled. Before leaving, he stopped by Marcus's table. You'll make a fine lawyer someday, he said quietly. You understood something I forgot. That justice is about finding the truth, not just winning cases. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered to hear the story. But Marcus's mother shooed them away, saying her son needed rest. As they walked down the courthouse steps together, Marcus noticed how blue the sky looked, how fresh the air felt. "Mom," he said, "can we stop by the library? I want to thank Mrs. Thompson properly. And maybe I can restart the tutoring sessions." His mother smiled, wrapping her arm around his shoulders. "Of course, baby, but first, we're getting you a new suit, one that actually fits. You've earned it." In the weeks that followed, Marcus's story brought changes to the juvenile justice system in their city. Judge Martinez kept her word about reviewing cases, and several other wrongful arrests were discovered and corrected. The police department implemented new procedures requiring all available security footage to be checked, and public defenders were given more resources and time to prepare their cases. Marcus returned to school a hero, but he stayed humble. He went back to tutoring at the library, now with even more students wanting his help. His dream of becoming a lawyer grew stronger, but with a new purpose, to help ensure that justice worked for everyone, especially young people who might not know how to make their voices heard. On his first day back at the library, Mrs. Thompson had put up a new sign in study room B. "Courage speaks truth." Below it, she'd added a quote that made Marcus smile every time he saw it. Justice is not just about following procedures. It's about finding the truth, even when the truth is hiding behind an overlooked door. The borrowed suit hung in Marcus's closet as a reminder. Someday, he thought, he'd wear his own suit in a courtroom, but next time, he'd be the one helping others find their voice and their truth.